Let me see, where is the... Yeah. That's good. Okay. What I would like to do now is give you a short introduction about a feature of the Schematron language that I found quite intriguing, actually, and it's called a query language binding. Now, binding sounds like it's some kind of kinky accessory to the Schematron, but it's actually a very useful extension, and you're probably already using it, maybe unaware, and if you are rarely using it, you're probably not aware of all the details. So let me fill you in on that. Oh. Yeah, it works. Okay, sorry. Just to set the stage, let's do a little Schematron first. What you have here is an XML document. It's a very simple document, and the rule is that all the codes in the document must start with the department code that's in an attribute on the root element. So as you can see, the bananas are not valid. And we want to have a Schematron schema that checks this. Now here is one, of course, one of the many implementations you could write for a Schematron. This one checks this, and if you run this schema against the XML document, you get the expected error message that the bananas are not valid. So far, so good. Now, as you can see in the schema, there are quite a number of expressions there. In multiple places, you can see there are XPath expressions. But what most people are not aware of is that Schematron is actually a container language, and that the language you use for expressions is not a given. In practice, it's XPath, but it's not a given. You can specify another query language, another language for your expressions. And this feature is called the query language binding, or QLB in short. So how does that work? You set the query binding by specifying the query binding attribute on the root element. And you probably already do it, because if you don't, you get the default, which is not very nice. The possible values for this, there are a number of reserved values for the query binding which are specified in the standard. And strangely enough, at least I think it's strange, not all these values are defined. So they are reserved but undefined. And we can somehow surmise from the names what they are supposed to mean, but they're not specifically defined. The bold ones here are defined in the standard. Another strange thing I would like to mention about these query binding names is that they are case insensitive, which is, I think, a bit strange, because in most cases in XML, all comparisons for IDs or names or whatever are case sensitive. This one is case insensitive, and I had quite a heated discussion with Rick Jeleff about why it is, but he couldn't convince me and I couldn't convince him, so it is what it is. So what of this is supported? Well, and now I think currently the implementation used most, or the most current implementation is Xsl, and that one only supports XSLT kinds of query language bindings, so no other ones. So let's assume for a moment you're a JavaScript, Python, COBOL, Zork, whatever language buff, and you want to write your expressions in a Schematron schema in this beautiful language you so like. What do you need to do officially? The first two steps are relatively easy. You need to define a name for your query binding, and you need to think of some kind of identifier. And after you've done that, you need to write a small specification document about what this query language binding actually is. And actually the Schematron standard defines for you what such a document should contain. And it's for the defined names, it has them in appendices. So you can look up what's there and write such a document. It's small, usually only 1 page long or so. And then comes the really hard part, of course. You have to write your own Schematron processor for your beautiful Schematron expression language. That is really hard because it's not possible, unfortunately, to, for instance, take Xsl and plug in some piece of software that suddenly understands Python or JavaScript or whatever. At least not that I'm aware of. And I think David, that well, maybe, he says maybe, you know. But I don't think it will be easy if you do it. So I think we don't have to talk about this anymore. But I just wanted to let you know what you would need to do if you want to add another expression language. So let's get back to the to what is happening in practice. In practice, the only query bindings supported, unless you have a bespoke processor, are the XSLT ones and maybe the XPath ones, because they're relatively easy. My advice would be not to leave the query binding attribute out, because then you get XSLT as the default, which means XSLT1, which means XPath1 expressions, which means, given the current state of the technology, severely limiting in what you can do. So my advice would be to either use XSLT2 or XSLT3, probably nowadays XSLT3, but XSLT2 will usually do also. Okay, what does it mean, the XSLT2 and XSLT3 query language binding? Of course, the first thing is you can use XPath2 or XPath 3.1 expressions all over your Schematron schema. It is good. The second thing is that you can use XSL keys, which is a lookup facility in XSL for quickly finding things by identifier or by some other something. I will tell you what that looks like. I'm going to show you an example of using XSL Key. And the third thing, probably even better, is that you can use XSL functions in your Schematron schema for if you have complex things to compute or to do or whatever. And that's very, very useful. And then what about the other XSL constructs? Maybe you want templates. Because templates can be useful, for instance, if you want to, in your function, do some very complex processing of a sub-piece of XML or something. Or XSL variables, which are a bit more flexible than the variables in Schematron itself. Well, officially, they don't work, because the Schematron standard only allows you to use XSL key and XSL function. Unofficially, they work, because all Schematron processors, at least the ones used most, work with an XSLT processor underneath and just simply process all these XSL instructions you put in your Schematron schema. So it's up to your attitude to conforming to standards, whether you want to use them or not. I leave it up to you. I personally use them a lot, so it works in general. Let's have a look of an example of using XSL Key. Here is an example of a document, and it contains items and orders to items, and the orders must reference any items by ID. Very simple. And let's also assume that this document is very, very large, much bigger than I can fit on my screen here. So let's try to write a Schematron schema that checks the ID references for the orders using Schematron using an XSL key. This is how it would look like, and let's look at the details of this Schematron schema. What do you need to do to make this work? First, you need to define your query binding, and I have set it here to XSLT3. XSLT2 would also work, but I use XSLT3 myself by default. Then you have to define the XSL namespace, because you're using XSL instructions XSL elements in your Schematron schema, so the namespace must be defined. Then you define your key. And I'm not really going into details about the XSL key instruction, but this one, a key is actually a quick lookup based on some string value, or I'm not sure whether it's only string, on some value, and you get some other things back with a quick lookup algorithm. And this one returns you items based on their ID. Once you've done that, you can use the XSL key function to retrieve any items based on their ID. And this works quickly. So this would be a way to use the XSL key instruction. Then let's have a look at using XSL functions, which is also interesting and also merits an aside about namespaces, you'll see. This example is a bit more complex, just to show you what functions can do. Here we have a list of things, and things have a name and a code and a price. And what we want to do in the Schematron schema is check whether the price is correct. And to be able to do that, we have a lookup XML, a small additional XML, which lists all the prices for the things. And if the thing is not mentioned in this lookup, it should use the default price. So for the things here, the first one is correct. The second one is off by 1 cent, probably a rounding error in the VAT computation or whatever. The third one is correct, and the fourth one is incorrect because it is not mentioned in the list, so it should use the default price. So what we want to do is write a Schematron schema that validates this for us. And a good way to do it would to have a function that, given the type of a thing, looks up for you using this external document the price and returns you the price. So let's try to write that. Here is the first part of the schema, defining a function. So let's go over the details again like we did for the XSL key. Again, we need to define the query binding, otherwise you can't use functions. Again, I used XSLT3 and I think XSLT2 would also work here. Again, you need to define the XSL namespace because you're using XSL elements in your Schematron schema. You also need to define your function, of course. This is the XSL function. For those who want to look into the details of the XSL, fine, but I'm not going to discuss that here. The function is called f::getPrice, so it's in the f namespace, because XPath functions must be in a namespace. And I defined the namespace here using the Schematron NS namespace element. Now, that might be considered odd, because why do you have to define your namespace using the NS element? Huh? So let's do a quick aside about namespaces in Schematron. If you have a namespace in Schematron that you want to use in your expressions, maybe in your match expressions, or in this case to define a function in XSL, you might think that you need to do this. You need to define your namespace just like you define namespaces in XSLT or in your XML documents or whatever, with a namespace declaration, in this case on the root element. However, in Schematron, that does not work. You must define any namespace used in your expressions in a Schematron NS element. Otherwise, Schematron will not recognize your namespace. So this, well, you can write it, but it will not work, which is very, very frustrating if you run into this for the first time and your processor says undefined namespace and you're crying to the processor, but it's there. But it will not work. So, given that we've defined the namespace using our NS element, how can we use this thing? What we can do is we can now simply call the function which gets us the price, and then we can compare it in a Schematron assert element to get you a correct message. From there on, it's simple. So, this is what I want to tell you about query language binding. So, quick wrap up. Schematron is flexible with regards to its languages, to its query language. In practice, you can only use XSLT. as a query language, and the advice is to use XSLT2 or XSLT3 because then you get a more advanced version of XPath that you can use. If you do that, you can also use XSL keys and XSL functions. And if you're sloppy with conformance to standards, you can also use any other XSLT construction in your work. So far for query language binding. And now if you hope you would allow me a small commercial break, because I have a book coming up about Schematron. It's due to be published in September by XMLPrague. It really describes, at least I try to describe and go into every nook and cranny of Schematron, from things like normal assert reports to query language binding to what David mentioned, title and P elements, whatever. To give you an idea about what's in the book, this is roughly the table of contents. And what I would also like to draw attention to are the first two appendices, because I try to make the book not only for programmers and for technical people, but also for people that do XML, but now and then have to write a Schematron schema and are not really programmers. They do have to understand XPath, they do have to understand namespaces. So what I try to do is add an introduction to XPath and add an introduction to namespaces in the book. Especially the introduction to XPath became quite lengthy, I think about 25 pages. But I try to explain these two technologies for beginners. So if you're interested, you have to wait. I'll announce it on the Schematron mailing list and on LinkedIn and all the other social channels. But you know it's coming up. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Ken. Mike? Microphone?
I'm going to be talking about a project after the break. It's a very public project, and the code that we are producing has to be as open and reusable and usable in different contexts as possible. And for that reason, I felt I had to avoid adding all of the non-Schematron XSLT constructs into the Schematron script, because that would disenfranchise any users who wanted to use, wanted to be part of the project, but chose not to use XSLT to implement Schematron. Okay. Not that I knew of anyone, but it was a principle of the project. Yeah. And the way I addressed that is anytime I wanted to escape from what was available to me, I would use a function in a namespace, and that was easily recognized by someone who is using this in a non-XSLT. But because the Schematron production scripts produce XSLT, an XSLT environment that is running that has a wrapper XSLT that imports all of the function definition implementations and then imports the generated Schematron, and that outer wrapper style sheet is used for validation, and thereby all of the function definitions are satisfied in XSLT using XSLT, but are available to a non-XSLT implementation by whatever means they want to do. And the recognition of the output of Schematron isn't the be-all and the end-all, but it is merely a piece of the solution that, with a wrapper, becomes whole with the other components. Okay. So I would offer that as an alternative approach.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Remarks? Yeah.
Kai Weber from Pagina. I remember faintly that we once had a problem with external functions or functions in different namespaces, as you have shown them. They, if I'm right, they used to work in the skeleton implementation when you were using the parameter allow foreign, and without allow foreign, they didn't work. Is that correct?
No.
No.
I don't think I completely understand you, but
okay. Because, and then maybe David can jump in as well, because there was a problem with copying these functions into the compiled XSLT.
I think you're right.
Okay, okay.
The XSLT code will not go to the...
Right, those functions will be copied to the compiled style sheet with the allow foreign function. And with Xsl, there was an issue, I just checked, looked it up, it seems issue number 83 on your GitHub repo, where you, David, were saying this is also not automatically copying the functions in different namespaces, and you suggested to use the callback API instead for this functionality. So this seemed to me back then that all this functions in different namespaces is not part of the official standard of Schematron, but some approach that may work or not work depending on which processor and which parameters you choose.
But it is part of the main standard, and it should work.
Okay, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if the standard specifies that if you use a specific query binding, you can also annotate.
You don't have enough microphones.
No.
Wait for microphone.
Wait a minute.
This has to be recorded. You need. Someone will be studying history of Schematron.
Sorry, George Bina from Oxygen. So I'm not sure if the Schematron standard actually specifies that if you use the XSLT tool, let's say query binding, the annotations from the Schematron schema in the XSLT namespace will be taken into account, you know, like used by the compiled XSLT version of the Schematron file. But because, as Kay said, there's a parameter in the specific implementation that basically enables this behavior. Yeah. In Oxygen, I think we enable this by default. We set this parameter by default. Yeah.
I don't know. The examples I showed you were run inside Oxygen without a problem.
Exactly, because we put it by default, because we expect people to that they put XSLT code, it should work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, but it's an implementation detail in the end.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's covered by the standard. Yes.
That was our problem. We always run.
Wait for microphone.
Oh.
Or just came down. If we want to discuss, we have two microphones, so we can have kind of battle
you get your exercise today.
Exactly. That was our problem. We were always running for years. We were running our Schematron inside Oxygen without any problems, and suddenly, when we want our Schematron to work outside of Oxygen as well. Then we run into this problem.
Okay.
Because that makes sense. You say that
we enabled that by default because we expected.
Right. And suddenly outside of Oxygen it broke.
Let me just wrap up. What I told you is what the official standard says, and maybe implementations don't implement it in full. But as far as I've seen up to now, I've not seen any problems using Oxygen doing this, what I just presented to you. And also not in Xsl.
I have a remark about the query binding. There's one limitation with the query binding approach in Schematron, and that is that the query binding language has to fit in an attribute. So you can't use a language that uses, for example, XML as a structure to describe that it's in a what I meant is that, of course, the identifier has to fit in the attribute, but the select expression and also the test expression for assertions also is in an attribute. So whatever language you want to use, you can't use, well, I'm not saying you can't, it's not easy to use some structured language to express your query language.
It would be fairly uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's indeed a limit. that's a limitation. I studied some other rule-based validation languages from the past, and there were some that had a declarative approach to queries and to checks, and yeah.
But basically also the example with the function. So the function was defined, is not just text, it has elements, XSLT elements and so on. But then from the assert test or something, you can refer to the function name. Yeah. So in a way, there is some possibility for that.
That's what I meant. It's, I think it's not impossible, but it's we have to think about how you would implement it. And I don't know as a solution that would be still. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's,
I think, David, what you're saying is that let's assume you just want a Schematron implementation that does a query binding to JavaScript. Then you have to probably put in tons of JavaScript into attributes, which would be very uncomfortable.
Or just imagine you have your own domain-specific language that selects nodes, and you use XML to express this language.
Oh yeah.
Then you can't put it in the attribute.
You have to use entities for all the angle brackets, for instance.
Or whatever you want to do. So...
no, let's not go there. Okay. Any more? Well, in that case, we're on the break. Okay.
So I think that coffee break should be ready. At least I hope so. It's everything for this slot. Yeah. So
yes.
We should continue at 11:30. In 30 minutes, we should continue.